All right, third try. First time I mispronounced your name, which is terrible because you're a guest on the show. Second time, a missile apparently flew over the city of San Francisco and disrupted the start of our podcast. But this time, we're actually going to get it right. I have Aidan Kankyoku. Am I pronouncing that correctly? All right, good. I got it right, everyone. I'm a good host. Uh, on the show today, and I'm really, really excited about this because Aidan's working on one of the most exciting and newsworthy animal rights initiatives of the last few years, maybe in animal rights history, because you were trying to outright ban slaughter in Denver. And you're going up against the Democratic Party, the mayor of the city, the largest lamb slaughterhouse in the nation that processes 500,000 lambs every single year at a single facility in Denver that you want to shut down. And why the hell do you think you can win?
Well, and as of today, I'm proud to announce that we just crossed the $2 million threshold of money being spent against us. So between our
Nice, yeah.
campaigns, $2 million. They're outspending us 8-1.
Yeah.
A cool ratio.
And somehow, based on how you live, I'm guessing you don't have $2 million hanging around.
Oh, well, I tend to keep it like stuffed in cash in the closet, but
nice. That's where the money is. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we are obviously, the opposition has money. We have people. That's the amazing thing about the animal movement. I think even I've, had the chance to meet a lot of people in other kind of movement spaces, especially thinking about the climate and those issues. Almost everything else that we could think of is a lot more mainstream than animals in terms of, what our ultimate goals are. But the depth of commitment that the core activist base of our movement has is like the envy of every other social movement that I've talked to in recent years.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's interesting because one of the complaints you often hear about animal rights is, oh, we're acting on behalf of the victims. We ourselves are not the ones at risk. And I actually I don't find that complaint very credible. I don't think it makes much of a difference because I think that if you look at the commitment of the activists, I mean, I've met so many pro-choice activists, climate activists, anti-war activists who are protecting human beings. And yet, in terms of the willingness to sacrifice and the commitment, animal rights can't be beat. And I think that's one of the reasons you've had the successes you've already had, which, I mean, even getting to the point of having the entire city of Denver vote on whether you should ban slaughter is a significant achievement. Now, if you win, it's going to be even bigger. But maybe can you just start, what was the genesis of this campaign in the first place? Why did you decide this was even feasible and worthwhile in the first place? I mean, maybe worthwhile is obvious to anyone who's listening to this podcast.
Sure.
But still, describe what you knew about slaughterhouses that made you think, all right, this is something we need to be doing.
Well, and it's always, as far as worthwhile, it's always a trade-off between some other thing we could be doing as activists for animals. So, we do have a pretty high responsibility on ourselves to make sure we're doing one of the best things we could be doing. There's not, one single best thing we'd be doing, but there's a lot of pretty ineffective things we could be doing.
That's so EA, Aiden. You're so EA.
I know, it's funny.
EA stands for effective ultras. No, but Aiden, you are one of the more EA people I know, even if you don't identify as one.
I've definitely warmed up to it. When I first came into the movement through DXE 9 years ago, I pretty much saw that side of things as like my arch nemesis, and I definitely softened a little bit on that.
Wait, I'm an EA, right?
Yeah. When did you start identifying that way?
No, I was an EA before EA even was a thing. Because and then Zach was EA, Brian Burns was EA. A lot of the early people were EA, all effective. I mean, it's not cool to be EA anymore post Sam Bankman-Fried, which that's a totally separate conversation because I think Sam Bankman-Fried got railroaded. I don't know if I ever told you that, but that's not the subject of today's conversation.
Well, and amazingly, I know all of his so-called victims are pretty much being made whole. I mean, the Sam Bankman-Fried thing actually was a big part of me, being more receptive to EA because I thought all the criticisms being made around that time were so atrociously.
You were the only person who became EA.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
you were the only person in the world who became more EA after FTX collapsed. For those of you who don't know, Sam Bankman-Fried was an effective altruist who ran a crypto exchange called FTX, and he's currently in prison. Actually, quite sadly. I mean, I joke around, but a guy sitting in a cage for 20 years for, I think, mistakes that I don't think were criminal. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. But specifically,
I'll just quickly say that before I got on this, my colleague Natalie was just begging me not to say anything that was going to get snippeted and soundbited and used against our campaign. So I didn't even last 5 minutes without doing that.
Yeah, alliance with one of the greatest frauds in America. No, I'm just kidding. Kidding both about the alliance, and actually, I legitimately do think Sam Bankman-Fried didn't commit fraud. But again, subject for another day. But say more about the genesis of this. I mean, maybe to start, I mean, honestly, I think a lot of people just don't know much about the lamb industry or the sheep industry. And you actually know quite a bit because you've done a lot of investigative work around sheep and lamb farming and slaughter. So just if someone just walks up to you and says, like, why do you want to stop the slaughter of lambs in the city of Denver? What is your answer to people? Why did you decide this is an important campaign? Now, and granted, the slaughterhouse ban is not just about lamb slaughterhouses, but the largest and I think most prominent slaughterhouse in the city of Denver is Superior Farms, which slaughters sheep and lambs.
Right. Well, so how I would answer that question would probably depend a little bit on who's asking, just in terms of what people are going to be interested in. I mean, it is, as you say, I do actually have something of a personal relationship going back with this company, because myself, along with a few other Colorado activists back in 2017 or 2018, acting with DXE, released an investigation of a feedlot that's applied to this facility. Sheep raising is a big thing in Colorado, along with cattle. Those are the main agricultural outputs here, and we've got a lot of big feedlots along kind of the eastern plains of the state. So it's being working on animal advocacy in Colorado, you come into contact with those industries a little more than chickens or pigs that you might encounter more in some other states. But that's
Sorry to
I'd
take
say
out of your flow, but do you think you can look at the camera, because this is on
oh
YouTube
yeah,
too?
sorry, okay, yeah, we'll do.
And it's
All
not
right.
as engaging. You're a very handsome person, Aidan. I want people to see your face and not your
Not,
cheek.
not as much in quarter profile. Okay,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah.
sure.
So look at the screen if you can. Sorry, but
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, not at all. So I think I would have to start an answer about the genesis of the campaign. It goes back about 4 years to myself and my colleague Eva Hamer, who I'd known through DXE for years. We decided to step back after just years of basically noticing the same challenges facing grassroots organizations. And it started, so we both organized with Direct Action Everywhere for many years. She was in Chicago, I was in Colorado. And we saw mainly around limits to growth as just kind of the recurring. I mean, obviously our theory of change in DXE, we were really inspired by things like Occupy Wall Street. We were trying to kind of generate mass protest episodes for animals. And, there were some periods of really exciting growth when I first attended the DXE forum in 2016 and got a little mentorship on how to actually be a community organizer, and, got our events from, but prior to that, I'd been doing one protest a month, and I would get 4 or 5 people to come, and they were all my friends I dragged from university. And then after that, we actually started doing some real organizing, and we went to getting 40 or 50 people to come to our protests. And that was really exciting. But then we kind of plateaued again there, and spent a few years trying to find a way around that, and then had the chance to spend some time in some other movement spaces, particularly Extinction Rebellion in London. I had a really exciting opportunity to go out and spend a few months with them, which they were kind of operating on a really similar model, and having a lot of success in the short term, but watch that kind of peter out pretty quickly too. So we decided to step back.
And now everyone's ended up in jail, which is so sad. I don't know if you've been
Right.
in touch with Roger Hallam at all,
That's
but
Roger.
it's horrifying that he's been in prison for 5 years. I know.
Yeah. That was a blow. So that, it went from basically in 2019 that looked like thousands of people, camping out in central intersections in London for weeks on end, and getting hundreds of people arrested to the point that they filled the jails and couldn't arrest any more people. And then a lot of the same patterns we've seen over and over again: internal conflict, stagnation of growth. I'd say the stagnation leads to internal conflicts that before that people were able to push through, because there's you're on the high of success, but when success starts to not come as easily, conflict comes out and things start to break apart. And so in the end, obviously Just Stop Oil kind of grew out of Extinction Rebellion, was a continuation of a lot of the same people. Instead of thousands of people doing these big spectacular kind of collective actions, it became a much smaller group of people that had to make much bigger risks and sacrifices.
Yeah, to get it done. So we just had a plane interrupt us, but you were talking about going to Extinction Rebellion and seeing some of the same problems. If I could just stop us for one moment, what was your thought on the cancellation of Roger Hallam?
Well, which one?
I mean, the one I know about is the stuff about the Holocaust.
The Holocaust thing.
Yeah, says, this is just another episode of human effery. And I thought it was crude, but it wasn't clear to me why it was such a. I don't want to lay my cards out before you are able to
Yeah,
share
no,
your
it was
perspective on it.
pretty obviously bad faith attack. What he was saying was taken out of context and spun to mean basically exactly the opposite of what he actually said in context. Which, to me, the lesson is just that as someone who's finds yourself in a leadership position, public facing leadership position with a social movement, you can feel a deep sense of injustice about what happened to Roger, and you can also just acknowledge, well, that is the world we're in, and you're going to need to be extremely careful about what you say. And, again, not flatter Sam Bankman-Fried in the first 5 minutes of a podcast interview. And, so I clearly haven't learned
Too late for you.
Yeah.
You're next, Ian. Yeah. So maybe we're not being responsible to our audience because no one knows who Roger Hallam is exactly. He's co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. I think a personal friend of yours, right? I mean, you know Roger pretty well. And it wasn't just they mobilized a lot of people. I think there were 1,000 people sitting in English jail cells, London jail cells, as a result of the civil disobedience they organized. I guess that was in 2019, and I think you were present there when it was all happening.
At the peak, I was fortunate to be there at the very peak of it. The first 2 weeks of October. Actually, we're on the 5-year anniversary of that right now. It's the first 2 weeks of October in 2019.
It wasn't just mobilization. They actually created systemic change. I mean, the entire UK government declared a climate emergency. There were significant policy shifts. My understanding is everything from like insulation to kind of gas stoves. There's so much that's changed in the UK as a result of this, but it also has come at great sacrifice, not just in terms of cancellations and leaders getting kind of taken out, but now literally put in cages. I mean, Roger Hallam is sitting in an English jail cell for 5 years now, and somehow still has seemingly very high spirits. But I don't know if that's just putting up a front, but he seems like he's doing okay.
You have experience with that. I mean, being on the inside and knowing you need to make the most of your sacrifice, and not, it's not, you're going to say what you have to say, and he's obviously spent years preparing for that.
Yeah.
At the risk of sounding too EA, our mutual friend James Osden, I know, has done some kind of cost benefit analysis on Extinction Rebellion for the impact that, even if you only grant that XR's kind of civil disobedience mobilization had, was responsible for 5% of these like watershed policies that came in the immediate aftermath. It still makes it one of the most cost-effective interventions that's ever been 100%. Done in the history of climate activism. Yeah.
Okay, so you're there, physically present, seeing all this unfold, and then how does this lead to the campaign you're working on now? Because the Ballot initiative is very different than thousands of people getting arrested.
Yeah, right. So I mean, I think it was such an interesting experience, and it ties back to something we just mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation. When I was first getting in touch with them and planning my trip out there, I met another organizer, Frida, and we kind of swapped this thing about I said, well, I'm part of this group in the U.S. called Direct Action Everywhere, and I think we have a really similar theory of change to you, but you guys have so much, your mobilization numbers like so much larger than ours. Because climate, and I thought, at first I thought maybe it was just because climate was more mainstream, and she kind of laughed and she's like, "Oh well, we always bemoan how much easier it must be to mobilize people for animal rights because you can like hold up these pictures of charismatic megafauna, and there's this very relatable suffering, and it's so much harder to explain to people why they should be worried about climate change. It feels so abstract." So we shared a laugh over the grass being greener on the other side, basically, and but that was still my kind of koan as I was going there is, why is this working so well? Why hasn't it worked yet for us? And
just as a point of comparison, in I think 2018 we had the largest single mass arrest event in our history, and one of the largest mass arrest events in the history of the animal rights movement, and we had 58 people arrested. Right. We're like, wow, 58, and in London they've got like over 1,000 people.
1,800 people were arrested.
Exactly. That's like, 1,800. Wow. So, that in 2019, we're like, oh, wow. I mean, obviously, I was very proud of them. I think they did an amazing job. But that's the point, that they literally have, you got to add 2 zeros to what we did, basically, to get to equivalent numbers, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. And, I came away from 3 months embedded with them without a very clear answer of why.
Why? Huh.
So
did you get arrested? Probably not, because
I so badly wanted to. It was. I mean, one of the lessons Although again, this is a hard one to apply to the animal movement. Like the atmosphere at an XR protest was just joyous. Like it was just a party. Everyone's dancing, and as you're getting arrested, people are just laughing, and it's just this joyous occasion. And I don't know, that doesn't feel appropriate to. Doesn't feel like the right mood at a open rescue outside of a slaughterhouse, obviously. So it's. Anyway, so yeah, I badly wanted to get arrested, but I also wanted to ever be able to re-enter the United Kingdom, and I thought I probably wouldn't if I got arrested with XR. So, so I came home from that and was trying to digest the experiences and try to figure out what lessons we could take from it, and they didn't present themselves easily, and so by that point, me and Eva had started to talk about stepping back from frontline work for a while to try to do some research. We'd identified a couple of research pathways that we thought could give us a little more clarity on the challenges we'd been, perennially encountering in our organizing. And then COVID hit, and almost immediately after I got back to the United States from London, which derailed pretty much all organizing across most social movements, at least temporarily. XR never recovered from that. It may have been the peak anyway. It's possible. I mean, I think there were signs that the group might have started to fracture even without COVID, but that definitely did it in a pretty significant way. And so, that really complicated too how I felt. I'd felt pretty good being there and thought, okay, we try to learn from this, but then seeing kind of how fragile it was. So yeah, Eva and I stepped back and we started this project that we called Pax Fauna, which was basically a series of research projects that we thought could help us identify strategies to overcome these challenges we've been facing in grassroots animal organizing for years. The one that ended up taking up most of our time was an extended study on public opinion involving mainly interviews and focus groups. So it was very qualitative. It was very kind of in-depth. Not, I think we were kind of, on the one hand, it was inspired by some of these survey findings that had come out in the previous decade, showing, in the same survey sample, you get 98% of people saying, whether to be vegetarian is a personal choice and no one has a right to tell me what to do, which, obviously is what's acted out in people's actions. But in that same sample, you get 30 to 50% of people saying they would support a ban on factory farming or a ban on slaughterhouses or a ban on just all animal farming. And, some of that might be just noise or people being confused about what the questions they're answering. But it seems to suggest that there's something there in like a disconnect between the way that the movement up and, for the last few decades has really focused on individual consumer change versus a different lens where the public might be more receptive to what we're asking for. And this was a germinal idea of DXE, obviously, was trying to shift away from focus on vegan advocacy. But maybe one of the things we noticed in DXE organizing was it didn't really get across. I mean, in two ways that I saw that.
Yeah, sorry. But I'm just reminded of all the times that people started spontaneously chanting, go vegan, go vegan, go vegan, go vegan.
Right. It didn't even get across to our activists, much less the public. Yeah. I think we always hoped that more than just vegans would want to get involved in what we were doing. Yeah. And that, occasionally people who didn't identify as vegan would come to a DXE meeting or event, in Colorado, and they almost never came back. It just wasn't, it didn't actually square with whether it was something on the identity level or whether it's because, too many of the activists there did start chanting go vegan or something like that. And also, in the reaction we got on social media or on, it's like we had this clear idea in our minds, at least in, the leadership or mid-level leadership where I was in DXE, that, we're not asking for individual consumer change, but we would go into restaurants where people are, acting as individual consumers of meat and do these disruptions. And so the reaction on social media would be like, why are you,
doing that? Yeah. Why are you screaming at non-vegans for eating meat?
Why are you forcing us all to go vegan? Like we don't, it's a personal choice, something. And we're like, no, that's not what we're saying. We're calling for systemic change. But
can I just stop real quick? Because I just want to acknowledge that people are probably screaming at us right now for laughing about the go vegan message and all the people who do vegan outreach. And there are a lot, and a lot of them are very good friends of ours. I don't think it's even so much that well, I don't want to speak for you, so I'll just speak for myself. For me, it's not so much that I don't think anyone should be doing vegan outreach. I just don't think it should be the dominant narrative of the movement. If that is the dominant narrative of the movement, we will almost certainly fail, in my view. And it wasn't what DXE was trying to do. So I can see a march, or certainly outreach, where people are yelling, go vegan, go vegan, go vegan, go, as being extraordinarily effective and awesome activism, especially when it comes to just training activists to be stronger in their personal lives. Because it's really hard to talk about animals when it's a movement that feels very marginal, when 99% of people are not vegan and you feel like you're fighting this really uphill battle. So there's a lot of value just getting out there and doing that vegan outreach. But as a dominant narrative of the movement, as your studies show, it's not one that's going to just attract a lot of support from the public at large.
Right. So that's exactly what, both, I think the evidence was already indicating as we went into this. And so I wouldn't even, yeah, right. It was like previous studies had basically demonstrated, okay, there's this huge chasm between where the public is willing to go with us on the individual consumer change versus where they're willing to go with us through this kind of more systemic lens. And so our research was asking, well, why have we failed to actually shift that interaction with the public? Like, why is it that when we're doing DXE actions where we're calling, using a more systemic message, how is that not getting across? And people are still reacting on social media saying, oh, you're trying to force veganism.
Can I just ask you to make that concrete for people? Because I think for a lot of people, the difference between individual and systemic, I mean, this is a lot of jargon that political scientists like to use, but what does that mean specifically for audience that doesn't know much about the difference between those two concepts? Like, what does that mean concretely? If you're out in the street and you're asking for individual change versus systemic change, what do you mean?
I think actually what you just identified was the problem. And that's what we realized, is that the language that we'd been operating through and the kind of lenses we'd been operating through, even in our own minds, weren't sufficiently pinned down. To the general public, they were just meaningless. Like, to just go out there and say, oh, we're calling for systemic change about it. Like, it just was an empty sentence that meant nothing, like conveyed no information about our intentions to people.
Are you saying the last 15 years of my life have just been an empty message? Thank you, Aidan. Thank you for acknowledging my non-contribution to the movement.
You dragged me along with you for 7 years, man.
7 years of emptiness. No, but I think you're right. I think you're right. And but part of the process is we learn as a movement. But say more about that.
Well, I mean, I'm so proud of so much that we accomplished together in DXE.
For sure.
Obviously.
It was amazing.
Right. And so, but the next, one of the things that we found that we could level up further from there is a way to actually ground this for people is like, ordinary members of the public who are going around with, I would say the most common way that relationship that people have to this question is like they eat meat, obviously, vast majority of people. And they also have seen something to tell them that there's something really wrong going on inside factory farms and industrial slaughterhouses that really does not align with their values. They're not all the way there with us on, all killing of animals, all using of animals being wrong, or the idea that we could get to a world with no killing of animals, and that actually it would be more efficient to feed the world that way, and it would be, all these other benefits that come out from being, treating animals, giving them the full moral consideration that they deserve. But they are deeply conflicted about what happens to animals in the modern food system. And they just avoid thinking about it. Like they just put that to the side. They feel that their own actions don't actually matter, that like a sense of futility, that even if I were to take this huge personal sacrifice and change my diet and take all the social costs that I've seen other people incur by doing that, mockery and alienation and not having food to eat and, public gatherings. If I did all those things, took this huge personal sacrifice on myself, it wouldn't really matter because it's this giant commercial industry that, it's like it seems like if I don't buy that burger, it's just going to go in the trash can. So people feel the sense of futility, that their individual actions don't make a difference anyway. And so there's no point in thinking about it. And so they just avoid thinking about it. They avoid thinking about the footage they've seen when they're shopping for meat. For most people, it takes a little bit of work. It's kind of an active thing. And you'd be amazed how many people, when we brought them into these kind of interviews or focus groups, said this exact thing. I try not to think about it when I'm shopping for meat at the grocery store, because if I think about it too hard, it will make me not want to eat meat for a while. But it doesn't actually matter if I do that. So I just put it out of my mind.
Studies of atrocities and historical injustices that we now look upon with shame have found that exact thing that you're describing, that people are looking away. Anthony Appiah. I forget how to pronounce his name. He's a social scientist and philosopher at Princeton. Or he might have moved to NYU recently. But anyway, he's a very famous scholar. He calls it strategic ignorance. And you saw this in the anti-slavery movement. You saw this with women's suffrage. When people kind of engage with an issue, mostly by just looking away and pretending it's not there, that is a sign that there's actually something deeply troubling about the issue. And there are actually some economists at UCLA who were planning to do a study of people's strategic ignorance. And their hypothesis was that the reason people strategically ignore certain issues is precisely because if they learned about it, they would change. And so in many ways, the very people who are turning away the most and most resistant to seeing what's happening in factory farms or slaughterhouses are the very people who need to see it, because they're the ones who are most likely to change, but they're being strategically ignorant and covering their eyes because they know they will have to change if they see it. So I think you're right about that there's something really interesting. That's an opportunity. I mean, it's an obstacle too, because obviously if everyone just keeps covering their eyes and they're not going to think about what happens at the grocery store and therefore won't think about, how much they need to change to ensure their values align or their actions align with their values when it comes to animals. But it's pretty fascinating. And I think one of the brilliant things about campaigns like the slaughterhouse ban in Denver or the factory farm ban in Sonoma County is that it allows people to kind of engage with the issue in a way that does not feel like it's attacking them, right? They can engage and be open and not be strategically ignorant without feeling like, I'm a scumbag.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not only to feel like people know that they're avoiding it. Like it is actually fully. That's what's amazing is and for a lot of us, it's like once you know that you have to avoid thinking about a thing, it's already too late.
Yeah.
You've acknowledged
something's wrong
the
there.
thing that's avoid.
Yeah. But the funny thing is, it still works, even though they know they're avoiding it because there's something bad there. It still works. It's kind of like the placebo effect. Have you heard about this research on the placebo effect, where for a long time there was this weird phenomenon in medical studies where you can give someone a sugar pill instead of the actual drug and they still get better somehow? It's like, what the hell? Because of the mind-body connection, you just think you got medication. And they thought, wow, that's really powerful. When people believe they got medicine, even if they just got a sugar pill, they get better. But then they did these studies apparently where they actually told people, by the way, this is a placebo. It's just a sugar pill. And people still got better. They still got better as if they got real medication. And it's because...
And then when they stopped getting the sugar pill, they stopped being better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's really weird how the mind can control so much of even just the physical outcomes of the world. And not just our own bodies, but the world around us, that what we believe in is what happens. Which brings me back to the question I asked. And I'm not saying we should jump ahead to this question I asked earlier about why do you believe you can win against all these overwhelming forces against you? But I don't want us to jump ahead too much. Continue your story. So you're sitting here, you come back from London, you're like, all right, we're not able to expand to the 1,000, 1,800 protesters. We're not seeing the mass mobilizations. You have this idea about systemic versus individual change. You're doing this research. Is there anything else you wanted to share about the research, like the high-level findings? I remember looking at it and thinking it was extremely compelling, but obviously I don't have it to my tongue the way I'm sure you do.
I think we've largely covered it in the last few minutes in the sense that it was the gap around what we'd been referring to as like systemic change, realizing that didn't really mean anything to people, and that we needed to handhold a little bit more through showing them a path of what we mean, painting a specific vision of what that more gradual change, that rather than falling, a huge, big sacrifice on individuals to, change their lifestyle, change their diet in a way that has actually, let's acknowledge real social costs. It's just not, the hard part isn't finding food. The hard part is the social alienation that comes from kind of pissing all your friends off by not eating meat. So, instead of it being on them to make this huge change, painting a vision for, okay, what's it going to look like to be transitioning away from factory farming and eventually away from animal farming altogether? And what's an action you can actually take in support of that? And maybe if I can get you to take some very small action, suddenly we start to get some of those psychological tendencies on our side, where there's this principle of consistency that if I take a really small action in furtherance of animal rights, it's going to make me more likely to want to be consistent now and take other actions. So we have this very unique legal political instrument in the United States. Very few other countries around the world have anything like this. It's only available in about half the states in the country of citizen-initiated ballot measures. And this is where any group of citizens can get together, write a law and circulate a petition among registered voters in that jurisdiction. So in our case, it was the city and county of Denver. We needed about 9,000 valid signatures from registered voters in Denver County to qualify each measure for the ballot. In practice, that means you collect about 16,000 because a lot of them are going to get cured out. And so between the two measures total, we had to collect about 32,000 signatures. And once you collect enough signatures, you turn it into the city, and they verify the signatures, and they say, okay, this will go on the next general election ballot. And if it gets onto the ballot, 50% of people plus one vote for it, it becomes the law. So this is a process to just entirely bypass the normal legislative process, which in our country is so broken.
Yeah,
And I know we're going to talk about that in a second. But it also, so even setting aside like this as a way to actually change laws, which is, I think, super impactful, and it's played an important role in several social movements in the past century in the United States. But setting that aside, even just as a way to think about how are we going to finally engage the public in a different dynamic than this one that's up until now been focused on individual change, consumer change, and therefore been so antagonistic. Where people are most resistant to what we have to say is when we're talking about individual consumer change. And we're seeing all these signals that they're so much more open to having this conversation about animal rights and ending the farming of animals, or at least radically moving away from it, radically changing it on the way to ending it. They're so much more open to having that conversation when it's in this kind of civic space, thinking about collective action. So people go through the world, we fill different roles. And one role that pretty much everyone in our current society fills is as a consumer, where they're going to stores and they're deciding what products to buy. And when they're in that role, they look at the world and think about it very differently. It brings up different values and different perspectives and focuses, puts different things in the frame than when they're operating in more of a civic role, or effectively a voter role. When you're showing up to polls to vote on issues, it brings up a totally different set of values. The consumer role brings up a very individualistic attitude. No one can tell me what to do. I have all these choices. Whereas you feel like an individual, and part of that is this sense of futility that actually, voting with my dollar isn't really going to make a difference. Whereas in this voter role, people are thinking about collective action. They're thinking about what kind of world do I want to create and be part of creating. And they're much more willing to entertain, making trade-offs and sacrifices at the collective level when everyone else is going to have to make the same trade-offs and sacrifices. So just as a way to engage the public in this much more supportive version of their minds, where they're so much more receptive to what we have to say, that was the first way that we really started to say, okay, I think this is going to be a direction that the movement needs to start going in to unlock wider support.
And at this point, this is not just a hypothesis. There's actually some evidence behind this. I know there was this poll done by the Sentience Institute that was replicated many years, showing that 50% of Americans basically said, yeah, if you give me a chance, I'll just outright ban slaughterhouses. And I still remember that I think it was Bailey Norwood, an agricultural economist who's beholden to the pork industry. I mean, he works with pork farmers in the pork industry all the time. He's basically a mercenary for the pork industry. He saw this survey, which was supposed to be a nationally representative survey of Americans, showing that 1 in 2 Americans wanted to ban slaughterhouses. And he said, this is nonsense. I mean, this is complete BS. This stupid animal rights group, they think they're doing science. I'm going to do a good survey and prove them wrong. And he did the survey, and I think the number went up. I think it went up from I think the original result was like 48, and he did it, and he said, oh, actually, I found 49. So he found the same result, and he was puzzled by it. But I remember there's a Twitter thread that was fascinating where he basically described what you described earlier, which is that Americans do have this deep kind of collective discomfort with what happens to animals in factory farms. But then when you frame it as an individual personal choice, they don't want to give up meat because they've been eating meat their entire lives. 99% of Americans are not vegan. 98+% are not vegetarian. And there's a tension between these two things. And, so my sense is what you did was you looked at that result from Bailey Norwood, the Sentience Institute surveys, and said, hey, we need to actually turn this into activism. Let's just not do surveys. Let's actually put it to work. Is that a fair characterization? Or
yes, and there was an intermediate step, which was, okay, we're seeing this very surface level representation of what might be going on in people's minds.
Mhm.
Can we get in there and actually understand with some depth, like what's going on here? Can we hear people in their own words explain
Yep.
how they're
Yep.
reconciling these two
Yep.
viewpoints?
And that's kind of the
And
studies
make
that you
sure,
guys did over 2 years after
right, that
COVID
was
hit.
right. Also extend. So we did about 200 hours worth of interviews and focus groups with about 200 ordinary, meat-eating Americans from pretty much all walks of life, all socioeconomic, ethnic brackets, different regions from the country, different ages, and lots of things were different across all those people, and there were a few patterns that were really, at least, very common. And so we've already talked about some of them. This idea, I try not to think about it when I've seen the footage. It's upsetting, but I try not to think about it. The strategic ignorance, and then the justification for that is this futility that, well, as an individual, my actions don't matter. So you present instead this, the idea of a ballot initiative or a vote, this opportunity to vote on these issues. And it pretty much destroys the futility argument immediately, right? Because it's not abstract. It's like, no, literally right now you have a choice. You have a choice in front of you about whether something very consequential is going to happen in, a change in how society treats animals. Now what questions do you have? Now what objections do you have? And they still, of course, they're still, now, more of the cultural questions but this kind of nuclear option of just throwing my hands up in the air and saying, well, it doesn't matter what I do anyway, so I'm just going to keep eating meat. That's gone.
Yeah.
And you saw a much more productive conversation. So that's where, we said, okay, well, let's put this into action, make this happen. And that's where we wound up with this pilot campaign in Denver.
Yeah. And Denver is a progressive city. My guess is it 80% Democrat? 70%
That's
Democrat?
about right.
80%?
85.
Okay.
I think 85 Biden in 2020.
Yeah, and the survey results done by Bailey Norwood and the Sentience Institute were nationally representative. So it wasn't just Democratic cities. And I think the hypothesis we all had was that Democratic cities like Denver, if anything, are going to be more supportive than a nationally representative survey. So the hope was, look, if it's 50% nationwide, then in Denver, even with all the cognitive dissonance avoidance, even with the strategic shielding of my eyes of that we think is a problem, even with the overwhelming obstacle of just so many people just not being vegan or vegetarian and therefore maybe not being supportive of the animal rights movement, that Denver would be a good test case to see if we could just outright ban slaughterhouses. And so, I mean, in many ways, you've answered the initial question I asked, which is, why did you think you could win against all this money, against the Democratic Party, against the Democratic mayor, against, I mean, this is a very large business that I think it's hundreds of jobs or thousands of jobs. I forgot.
It's less than 200 jobs, but that is their main talking point. It does about $80 million a year in revenue.
Yeah.
Which, what that means for the tax base of the city is something. I mean, I think there's, agriculture over the last 150 years has gone from being like 90% of jobs and 90% of the economy to a tiny fraction of our economy. I think that's it. I do, since I'm, been in kind of combat with this opposition campaign for the last months, I have to say, economically, it's not a significant operation. I mean, the number of jobs affected by this closure would be a tiny rounding error on one round of tech layoffs for any tech company that operates in Denver, any of the big tech companies, which they all do. So, and similar for like the revenue and the tax base thing.
Yeah, and the healthcare costs, the environmental costs of having a slaughterhouse in the city, you could just take all that money that you save, not even directly in kind of just the tax base, but just the externalities from the slaughterhouse, and just give it to the workers, and they're probably better off. Like, if you really are concerned about the workers, my view would be, this relates to the idea of UBI and how you universal basic income and how you affect these transitions in large industries like the coal industry or the fossil fuel industry or even the automobile industry. There's a lot of automobile manufacturing that, may go by the wayside if we're switching completely to electric cars, or at least there'll be a big transition away from building internal combustion engines. And I think one of the solutions is, well, if the society benefits from this transition, let's just give people who are going to suffer or bear some cost because of this transition some support. So for the long term, they don't have to bear that cost alone, because we all benefit from it. So we all should bear some of the cost. And I think it's a fair trade for society. And I think the same would be true of a slaughterhouse. Let's give these slaughterhouse workers the support they need. But
right. I mean, the city of Denver just got an 8 or 9 figure grant from the federal government, I think under the IRA, to try to clean up the Platte River, which is this river that flows through Denver that the slaughterhouse sits on the bank of, and which feces from the slaughterhouse contaminates, and is probably a major reason that the E. coli levels in this river are so elevated that the city considers it unsafe for recreation.
Yeah.
So I mean, the amount of money it's like,
just give that $10 million to the workers. I'm sure they're going to be happy about that, and that's just one consequence, right? That doesn't even account for the climate consequences. And sheep and lambs, we don't eat sheep or lamb meat very much in the United States anymore. Mutton actually used to be one of the largest meat products in the United States, but there was a transition in approximately the 1950s to switch away from mutton towards other meat, in particular chicken. And chicken is now the dominant meat in America. But on a per calorie basis, my understanding is lamb meat, you might know this better than I do. I'm pretty sure sheep and lamb are actually the most devastating industry in all of livestock. And livestock is a massively devastating industry. I mean, we're talking about anywhere from 10 to maybe 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock. On a per calorie basis, avoiding lambs is the most important thing you can do, from what I recall. Is that correct?
In terms of GHGs, yeah, they swap back and forth with cows depending on which metrics you're using. But yeah, it's in that top.
It's top two for sure, and arguably the top one. So again, I mean, if all of us are going to benefit from this and we save the planet from potential catastrophic climate risks, it's probably worth it to just support these workers rather than keep the jobs and have the planet destroyed. That seems like a pretty good trade for everyone, including the workers themselves.
Yeah,
but
right.
Has the climate stuff even come up in the context of this slaughterhouse ban? Because I can't imagine that Denver is a city where people don't care about climate change. I'm 85% Democratic voters. Surely people care about greenhouse gas emissions.
There's a climate vote for sure. I think when you get down to actual voters on the ground, people tend to be a lot more motivated. Now, let's say the conventional wisdom is that people tend to be a lot more motivated by local pollution than by kind of global scale climate. Maybe even on voting, if you tell people that, the feces from the slaughterhouse is contaminating the river, or the facility was just fined $120,000 by the EPA literally 2 weeks ago for mishandling anhydrous ammonia, which is an incredibly toxic, chemical that can become airborne very easily. So it's a violation under the Clean Air Act. Those things tend to seem a little more motivating than talking about the climate impacts of lamb, especially, obviously the opposition's kind of narrative as well. You just ban this in one city. The slaughterhouse is already close to the edge of Denver County. Are they just going to move, out of town? And what's actually going to change? Which, obviously we look at this as part of a longer term strategy, trying to catalyze a movement. And we can talk more about that. But I think especially as we get into the conversation about the relationship between sort of the political establishment and how it's reacted to all these initiatives. But I think we probably could and should do more to emphasize the climate. I mean, the numbers are so stark.
I think you're right, though, that climate change has become less of an important issue for even Democratic voters. And I have to say, part of the reason for that is because public attitudes are just so fickle. I think if this had been 2019 or 2020, when Extinction Rebellion was happening, when Sunrise and Standing Rock had unfolded just a couple of years ago, then I think a lot more voters would be interested in that message. But one weird thing that's happened with American political conversations is we're just flipping back and forth from one issue to the next, and everyone is just concerned about one thing, and then we move on to the next one thing. And there was like a short period of time where climate change was the one thing that everyone was talking about, and that was a nice window. The reason I know this is because I've seen a big change. I ran for mayor in Berkeley, and climate was on the top of everyone's minds. And to a certain extent, that was actually a local political issue too, because that was the same summer that the skies went red, if you remember, because of all the wildfires in Northern California.
Yeah.
But
I was there.
Yeah, that's right. You were there. But we've seen a dramatic change in the last few years where even Berkeley, San Francisco voters, where you think, these are the most progressive voters in the country, arguably, they just don't seem that motivated by climate anymore. And I think it's partly because like social media plus concentrations within the media industry, all local media has basically died. You have like the New York Times, the national broadcast outlets, and that's basically it. And they have independent media, which is surging, and I think that's a good thing. But other than the practical stuff that actually affects me, the only thing I'm voting on a national or even state scale is stuff I see everyone else talking about. Like there isn't a lot of diversity of perspective beyond like the immediate practical things I see in my day-to-day life. So if I see that the Platte River in Denver is red and polluted or it stinks, that's going to affect me because I can actually see it. I can feel it. It actually has an impact on my life in a day-to-day way.
Yep.
But beyond that, even really important things like the threat of nuclear war, climate change, artificial intelligence, these are things that matter to me only when the entire media ecosystem converges on one issue. And unfortunately, that means some of the most important and biggest issues in the world just don't get addressed, because there's only so much you can really do on climate change, on sexual harassment, on civil rights and police brutality, if the nation's attention is just something that unfolds in 3 months and everyone forgets about it. Like right now, the best example of that to me is the Gaza protests, where like 6 months ago, the entire nation was just obsessed with this issue. And there still is some stuff, but it's definitely died down. It's like no one even cares anymore. We're like more concerned about how Kamala Harris laughs. Like, is her laugh a good laugh or a bad laugh? That has literally, I think, gotten more media attention over the last 2 months than a lot of the protests, right? The protests.
Yeah.
But so it's really sad, but I can see what you're saying about climate change maybe not having the impact that you might think it would have, given that Denver is a city of progressive voters who in theory want to protect the planet from destruction.
In theory,
they want to prevent the destruction of the planet, but in practice, they don't care.
This is, I certainly motivated reason. I mean, I'm stuck in a position in Denver with this pilot campaign right now that I just have to hope that, the average voter has a lot more skepticism of the media than certainly was true 2 or 3 decades ago. I don't know. We're going to find out if that's true. I mean, the media apparatus locally, I'm sure we'll get into this now, that all the powerful factions that have united against us here. But the media apparatus here has just been very hostile to, I think part of that, we've learned a lot. I think some of that came from us, learning kind of media manipulation 101 and how much of, like a great example here is some of the first TV segments that came out about the fur ban. So really, a quick background on the fur ban. Obviously, there's been a wave of fur ban legislation across the country, California becoming the first state in 2019, largely on the heels of DOC's successful passage of bans in Berkeley and San Francisco. And then Boulder, our friend Brent here in Boulder, largely soloed a fur ban ballot initiative in 2021, which passed narrowly.
I like how you use that verb, soloed. It sounds like a video game. Like he soloed that campaign. He soloed it.
We pretty much, it was pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I was like sitting in my basement doing all these interviews, and I was like, oh, there's a kind of a historic thing happening around me, and I'm missing out on it. But then so the definition of fur in all these cases is fur attached to skin. And we went to this fur shop after the measure passed in Boulder and realized they'd just done this, shystery thing where they just, took fur, removed the fur from the skin. I mean, it was, they killed the animal to get the fur, removed the fur from the skin and like attached it to something else so that they could still sell some, a fur hat that like for everyone would be indistinguishable from being a fur hat. So we're like, okay, we got to close that loophole. And in doing so, it's upped it's set. So, we've taken on a new level of challenge with the Denver fur ban, where it's now including fur felt, which is, the same thing. I mean, it literally, you still treat the animal the same way, you still kill them, and you're still doing it for a fashion statement, but the skin isn't there. So you take the fur off, you turn it into felt, and you got, a super high-end designer cowboy hat that costs anywhere from $600 to $1,200 for a hat. And that's, rabbits or beavers usually. And then you've got fly fishing lures where, to trick some fishes into ruining their day and probably killing them, you attach fur from, you grow a rabbit in a cage and kill them and take their fur and tie it around a fish hook.
And this initiative is also on the ballot. You basically, from what I recall, you collected signatures for both on the same time because it was just more efficient to put them both on the ballot.
There's a few things. We wanted to find out if it was easy to do two at the same time, because you get two for the price of one. Circulating the measures, circulating the petitions. You just have your activists standing there with two clipboards instead of one, and it went really well. So we're glad we did it. We also got to play into a dynamic where
I wonder if that means do you regret doing only two then? Maybe you should have done like 20.
we want to try. So there's a limit somewhere,
Yeah,
but we don't have any reason to think it isn't 3 or
yeah,
4 or
exactly. If you
higher
do
than that.
20, just by random
Yeah.
chance, one of them might win. It's kind of like you roll the dice enough times. Just do like 200 initiatives, and statistically, eventually you'll get to one that wins, right?
Right. I mean, if that's interesting. If you just swamp the ballot so
Yeah.
much, are people just going to be pissed at you or are they going to do the moderate thing and be like, well, let me, split my votes across these
Sure.
and I'll vote yes on the reasonable ones and whatever. So that was kind of what we were going for with the fur ban is we hoped, okay, the fur ban will be, an easier win. It's something that most people already support. And it's got all this momentum. And then hopefully we get a bit of a foot in the door effect where it's like, well, okay, if you support getting rid of fur farming, because it's cruel and unnecessary. Well, let's have a conversation about, why we're still factory farming sheep and other animals. But in the case of Denver, the one slaughterhouse we have left in the city happens to be a sheep slaughterhouse.
Yeah. I want to get more into why the media was against you, but just on the fur ban stuff, I was a little surprised when you told me that would be an easy win because Denver is a very cold city. And I can imagine a lot of people wearing fur in the winter. I mean, when we won in Berkeley and San Francisco, everyone's like, so what? It's literally San Francisco, the coldest it ever gets. It's like in San Francisco, when it's in the 50s, everyone's like, oh my God, it's so cold. It's so cold. Yeah. And it's like a balmy 50. It's like sunny and nice. But in Denver, I mean, it gets super, super cold in the winter. I mean, I've been there in the winter and it's freezing. I mean, so why did you think it was going to be an easy win? And do you still think it's going to be an easy win?
So it's colder in Denver. I think I've probably seen more fur trims in San Francisco than in Denver.
Really?
I think it's a fashion thing rather than a weather thing, right?
Okay.
I think Denver just doesn't have there's a
you guys are losers, in other words.
Yeah, there's a long-running magazine.
Cool. You guys are losers.
About Boulder, where Boulder always gets ranked the worst dressed city, but the best looking naked.
Oh, nice.
Everyone's in great shape, but people aren't really concerned with fashion sense here. And I think Denver's got a similar culture.
Okay. So there isn't just like a high fashion,
Yeah, correct. I mean,
there was in San Francisco, for example, even though it is a pretty warm city, I think there were actually, I think the figure is, it was a long time ago we ran this campaign. I think it was 2017 when we did this. I believe it's close to $100 million in fur sales in one city. Maybe it wasn't 100 million because it was 600 million statewide, but I think it was at least tens of millions of dollars in fur sales because you have extremely wealthy people and Union Square. I mean, they have some of the most expensive shops in the world. And a lot of those shops were selling $20,000, $50,000 fur coats.
Yeah. And people are coming in for tourism.
Yep, and they want to buy a nice fur coat when they go to Union Square.
Yeah.
And that sounds like that's not a Denver thing.
Not much of a thing in Denver. There was about 6 shops in Denver selling fur when we started the campaign. Neiman Marcus was one of them. They dropped it under CAFT. So now that's down to, and I think one other one moved out of town just at the threat, with the measure getting on the ballot. So we're down to 4 or 3 maybe. So that's fur coats. But so the thing that's going to be the wedge is actually the stuff that we've expanded to include. So it's the felt. So it's this, the opposition's main talking point is cowboy hats and fly fishing lures. And then they've got, we have a Native American exemption in the measure, which is the exact same exemption that exists in the California legislation. It was written by tribal lobbyists in Washington State when HSUS was, proposing an early fur ban there. That measure never actually got implemented, but it was, became the model legislation. So, so they've turned around and tried to make that a wedge too, saying it's not, it's exclusive to people who are members of recognized tribes. So those are the wedges they're trying to drive around fur, and they've raised. I mean, I think we were not expecting much of an opposition there. Instead, they've, our campaign has raised about $250,000. Just the fur campaign has raised about $400,000. Wow. And the slaughterhouse campaign has raised about 1.7 million.
Okay.
So it is not at all a shoo-in right now. It is. It is. We are in full. It's a
so
full
they spent $400,000 fighting for 4 shops, and I'm imagining these shops are not very large shops. Is that true?
So a lot of the money is coming from what's called the National Western Stock Show, which is the largest livestock county fair kind of thing in the country. Takes place in Denver every January. Lasts for 2 days, but does tens of millions of dollars of economic, and they're saying that many, you know, that's who's funding the opposition. I think it's less that there is actually a significant amount of economic activity on the line for them in the short run. I think it's more that they all correctly recognize that these measures are a shot across the bow, you know, more existentially for them if the movement can build momentum around these kinds of wins.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to this question you were exploring about why the media turned against you, and maybe a great example of that is even just some of the recent coverage we've seen in the media around the investigation. So, actually, first, can you just describe the investigation that just broke? So, for all the people who don't know, and shame on you if you've been living under a rock if you don't know, investigation just broke. But describe the investigation and kind of what you see as both the media and political implications of this investigation.
Yeah, so the election will take place on November 5th. On October 9th, along with, or mainly the folks at the Animal Activist Legal Defense Project at the University of Denver released an undercover investigation that was given to them by anonymous investigators who got inside of the slaughterhouse in Denver and placed some hidden cameras and captured some pretty, the reality is, I think everyone listening to this, we know that this is what's happening every day in every slaughterhouse in the country. And we know that, the laws around quote unquote humane slaughter are a story, a fiction that doesn't really exist in any meaningful sense inside of these facilities. So there's, you will find law breaking inside of every facility. And even if every facility was following the law as it's written, you would still find hell on earth. So that's what we found.
Yeah, the footage is incredibly grim. It's really disturbing. And it's just, the thing about this footage, I mean, you always see really grim and disturbing footage from slaughterhouses, and obviously different things capture different people emotionally. But to me, the combination of the mockery of the animals that was happening, slapping lambs on the butts, like these weird simulated sex acts right at the slaughter line, literally right at the place, I think within a few feet of the place where the animals, these poor lambs, are electrocuted, and oftentimes not even properly electrocuted. So they're still conscious and awake when their throats are slit and they're bleeding out. Within a few feet of this, you see men going like this and just engaging in simulated sex acts. I don't even know what that's about and why they're doing this. But it's incredibly disturbing and suggests like this weird casual attitude towards brutal violence that, I mean, to a certain extent, I think that almost always has to be the case, because for the same reason that when ordinary consumers look at actually what's happening, they can't deal with it. That happens to the workers themselves, but obviously they have to see it because they're cutting the animals' throats, they're electrocuting them, they're eviscerating them. And so the way they simulate that same strategic ignorance is they pretend it's a joke. And that actually happens in a lot of atrocities. Jonathan Glover, who wrote the book Humanity, another scholar who looked at kind of atrocities through human history, he found that in the Holocaust and other episodes of mass violence, like the rape of Nanking in China, when the Japanese murdered and raped hundreds of thousands of people in what was then the capital of China during kind of the invasion of China during World War II, that in all these historical episodes of atrocity, one of the things that the people directly perpetrating the atrocity have to do is engage in what's called cold jokes, right? They're these chilling jokes. The reason they're called cold jokes is they're basically trying to chill like the actual emotional impact of what they're doing by telling a joke, right? Because if someone, even you yourself, start thinking, oh man, this seems wrong, but someone's joking around, joking is a way to relieve tension. We see this even in our social communities. There's a tense moment, someone cracks a joke, everyone's laughing, we feel better about things, right? And that's good in a lot of contexts. If you're anxious, if you're stressed, someone tells a joke, it's great. It's not great if the anxiety and tension is something that is legitimate and based on any atrocity that is unfolding in front of you. You actually don't want people telling jokes about that. And that's what people do. And so in this slaughterhouse, it's very clear that that's kind of psychologically what they're doing. I don't know if it's something that's more organized by the management or it's something that's just spontaneously coming out of the workers. But you can see this in some of the video that's released, just literally, men going, as if it's not even clear. Are they saying they're having sex with the sheep, or are they saying, I couldn't really interpret it. I don't know if you have a read on what was going on.
Yeah, nothing beyond what you've already shared. We spoke to a former worker at this slaughterhouse, and again, it's nothing, this is what you'd find in any facility in the country. He put it effectively, is you have to degrade the animal to the point that it's just a thing to be able to do this. And how that affects you spiritually, and emotionally, and how you go home to your family afterwards and try to, have normal relationships with other people. Pretty devastating.
So tell us about the reaction. I mean, this literally just dropped. Was it yesterday? Was it really yesterday?
Every day.
I can't even believe it was yesterday. It feels like it was like a year ago. I kid you not. I'm kind of blown away that it was yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday was probably the most stressful day of the most stressful month of my life.
Wow.
So it's been every day has felt like 2 weeks in the last.
Congratulations, because
it's about Labor Day.
I mean, some of the coverage, especially the local coverage, has been disappointing. But there's a great piece in The Intercept. There's a great piece in Axios. There's a great piece in Vox. Vox issued a newsletter going into detail on the ballot initiative and this investigation. But I mean, how are you feeling about the media reaction? And maybe you can say a little more about the local media and the hostility we've seen. Because I sense that too. I read the Denver Post article and I was pretty disappointed. Granted, the Denver Post article wasn't that hostile as much as it was just like a little biased and misinformed. But share how are you feeling about that?
But I mean, you contrast it with like how the Denver Post, so being in the Denver Post, it's the largest newspaper in Denver. Mm-hmm. It's owned by a private equity firm. I mean, it's a reflection of the total death of journalism is corporate journalism in particular in the United States. Mm-hmm. Like you contrast how much skepticism they applied to the claim. Which, we've talked about this before. It's like, what's the accusation? Is it that we like set up a fake slaughterhouse and got a bunch of lambs inside of it and faked all of this? Yeah. Like what? Like, or it's just out. They're applying so much skepticism to every claim. Like, oh well, they say it's in the Denver slaughterhouse, and they say it's showing animal cruelty, and they say that this bit's illegal or that bit's illegal. Mm-hmm. It's like compare that to the skepticism that they apply to every claim from the opposition. Yeah. They just let them get away with any completely spurious claims that would just take the simplest amount of due diligence to see are totally exaggerated. Yeah. And so, the Denver Post editorial board put out a scathing endorsement against us 2 weeks ago. I almost think that, something I'm holding on to a little bit of hope with, because I do think vast majority of people who, the fly fishing community in Denver has some questions about the fur ban, because it would ban these fur-based lures. But other than that, the most common reaction in Denver is, you can still buy fur. People still do that. That's not already illegal. And people, say they're on board with it. And I almost think, the Democratic Party and the Denver Post and the mayor coming out against both measures, I almost rather that than that they'd only come out against the slaughterhouse ban. Because I think a lot of people potentially, and again, I might be giving, the average person who's just like going from home to work and trying to get through the day and doesn't really have time to think about these issues deeply, or doesn't have time to curate an independent media diet, how much they're able to spend on this. But I do wonder if people are going to see that and say, really? Like, they're for fur coats? Like, the Democratic Party is throwing their lot in with the fur coats. The mayor of Denver is throwing his lot in with fur coats. The Denver Post is like making it seem like banning fur coats is, some kind of wildly radical thing. Like, that doesn't really seem right. I already thought fur coats were banned. And I hope that it's going to kind of undermine their legitimacy. I think they've just kind of been so hostile that I think it might drive some people away. And we got word that, and I think by the time that this will be known by the time the podcast actually comes out. But I think just such a great example of like where this issue might find itself situated in kind of our current political landscape is that, so the Democrats came out against it, all, in a very lopsided way. The Denver Post, mayor of Denver, the Working Families Party, which, is supposed to be kind of on the progressive side of things. But the DSA chapter in Denver is about to announce, we've heard that they're about to announce their endorsement in favor of both measures.
That's awesome.
And I think there's a lot of people who, plug their nose and vote for a Kamala Harris or a Joe Biden, but say that they like something different. And, when it comes down to local politics,
I'm outraged. Are you saying you're not riding with Biden? Is that what you're saying? Natalie told you not to say anything controversial in this podcast, Aidan,
Yeah.
and I've just outed you as not right in with Biden. Just kidding, sorry.
Well, they've dredged up my old Kamala Harris.
You really don't want to go there. Oh wait, they dragged it out in this
that.
campaign they have?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. They made a the campaign against the slaughterhouse ban put, I would have to guess, $8,000 to $12,000 into producing a video.
Wow.
Completely about the Kamala Harris disruption.
That's crazy.
And who knows how much they're actually going to spend on circulating it. Yeah. I mean, I think they're probably going to like text it out to everyone in Denver or something.
Yeah. And so what you're talking about, actually just want to share what you're talking about, because everyone's going to be wondering, what the hell does Aidan have to do with Kamala Harris? What did you do to Kamala, Aidan?
I attacked her. Oh, you want me to explain?
Yeah, you can explain it.
Oh, okay. So in 2019 Animal Liberation March during the ALC in California, Almira walked up to me and said, "Hey, do you have an important role today?" And I was like, "Oh, not really." And she's like, "Oh, well, there's this forum where all the candidates are meeting. We thought they were going to be at the California State Democratic Convention, but this is a 2019 presidential primary. It's like May, and all the candidates are going to be at this little forum, and we want to do it. Someone to go in and disrupt." So I managed to sneak into this like press event. It's the kind of thing where
I think just to give a little more context. We can't prove this, but we think that what happened was they knew there was a big animal rights march, and they knew there were going to be a lot of people coming in to this Democratic meeting demanding they address animal rights. And they did the cowardly thing the Democratic Party always does. Sorry to everyone who loves the Democratic Party, but actually not sorry, because the Democratic Party is terrible and corrupt. But they moved it away and had these secretive meetings in separate places, including a panel of Kamala Harris, because they just didn't want to address the issue. It was strategic ignorance systematized by the Democratic Party. And this is why Almira came to you and said, "Hey, we have to deviate," because they basically they left the chat. They just like ghosted us and said, "We don't want to talk about animal rights, so we're just going to disappear," which is totally cowardly. And that's why Almira pivoted to the plan that you're going to talk about right now. Or it wasn't even a plan. Right. It was just,
There's no plan. It was the planless plan. So I slip into this, event with a bunch of journalists, and the person, it's the candidates are taking one at a time on stage, and the first person, half of them have already gone. Bernie's already gone. Beto's already gone. All the people I would have most preferred to disrupt. And the first person on stage is Kirsten Gillibrand, senator from New York, who was running at the time. And so I had the presence of mind to say, optics probably aren't the best. She's a woman. I'm probably it's probably might not go over so well. So I sit and wait, and I'll see who's next. And it seems like it's getting to the end of the day. I don't know how many more people there are going to be. And the next person's up, Kamala Harris. And I'm like, okay, well, obviously the optics are even worse, but she's the senator from California. She used to be the attorney general, and we're in California. We have all these ongoing open rescue prosecutions. Yep. So I was like, okay, this, there's an ass that makes sense here.
And for the record, when you watch the video footage, I did apologize for the action, and I feel bad about it because I apologized for the poor planning. I'm getting ahead of myself. The point I'm making is you do it in extremely gentle fashion. You just kind of walk up very peacefully and just take the mic out of her hands and start talking. But the massive overreaction by people who clearly were motivated, not because they actually thought you did something dangerous or did something even wrong, but because they just didn't like animal rights activists. They wanted to justify why they eat meat and why they don't give a damn about what happens to animals in factory farms and slaughterhouses was mind-blowing. We were on MSNBC for a good 5 minutes. And I will say, not only was potentially the future president of the United States the person who took the mic out of the hands, and I have to say that's going to be a great story for the rest of your life, especially if he becomes president. So for that reason alone, let's hope Kamala becomes president, so we can always say she may be the president, but Aidan was the one who took the mic from her. But the current press secretary for Joe Biden was the woman who confronted you and screamed at you. And I think didn't she physically attack you?
She got up and got, she put some, attack would be unkind. In the same way that I did not attack Kamala, she didn't attack me. But
this is Karine Jean-Pierre. She's the current press secretary. She's one of the most famous. So you were at the height of power in that conversation. So it is.
Yeah,
And they're using this against you now.
it's been suggested that I really made her career. I'm not going to say that myself, but
That is
I'm
true.
sure
She
I would
got
be
a
canceled
ton
for
of
it.
positive media attention.
She got a big promotion
Yeah,
after
I
that.
will say, so I wrote an apology, not because I necessarily thought that, I mean, I definitely didn't think you did anything wrong. I don't think anyone did anything wrong. But I mean, this is 2019. It's not peak Black Lives Matter, but it's getting close to there. And I actually think while the rest of the nation, peak Black Lives Matter was definitely George Floyd, I feel like for activist movements, it already hit. I mean, it was already something that everyone is super concerned about. Anything that, threatened or endangered people of color, and especially Black people in this country, was something that activists were not down for. And I honestly apologize mostly because of the miscommunication that was caused by an action that had no intent, because that action was absolutely nothing. And it is a little silly to say, like, okay, of all the most endangered Black people in this country, Kamala Harris is not on the top of the list. I mean, she's one of the most powerful, privileged human beings on the face of the planet. She could be the next president. But even the false impression that people had that the animal rights movement wasn't supportive of the idea that, everyone in this country deserves safety, it wasn't good optics. But the other thing I'm going to say is I actually thought much more important than my apology was the thing that you wrote afterwards, which persuaded a lot of people. I still remember to this day, Leighton Woodhouse, right? So Leighton was like, initially he was like, oh my God, what did you guys do? This is such a disaster. Leighton Woodhouse is a journalist. He's written for The Nation, The Intercept. He's worked with us a lot. And I remember him like texting me frantically and just saying, like, are you out of your mind? What did you do? And Glenn Greenwald did the same thing. Like Glenn and Leighton, because Glenn was there at the Animal Liberation Conference and he's like, dude, what are you guys doing? I support you in a lot of stuff. This didn't seem like the right action. And Glenn and Leighton and I had this chat, and they're all just blowing up this chat saying, Wayne, are you out of your mind? Because they thought we had planned it. They thought this is something that you went out of your way to target like the one Black woman who's running for president. But then Leighton read your piece. You wrote a very thoughtful piece afterwards, which I've always thought you're one of the best writers in the animal rights movement. You should frankly write more. I mean, I don't know if you have any plans to start a Substack or something, but I think it'd be a great idea. You and Dan are two of the people I really think should be writing more. Dan Kidby, who's one of the co-founders of Animal Rebellion, Animal Rising. I think he's got a lot of really great ideas, and I think he's a good writer too. But anyways, you wrote this great piece just setting this out, saying like, look, our intent. I mean, actually, do you remember that piece? Why don't you describe it? Because it convinced Leighton. After Leighton read the piece, he shared it and said, actually, never mind. I actually think read this piece before you make a judgment about this action.
I don't know. I've actually blocked out pretty significant parts of this whole experience. So maybe you remember it better than I do.
I think the basic idea was the basic idea about nonviolent direct action, that you came at this from a place of love, that this is not an attack on anyone, but it's an effort to bring us all up to a better moral place where we're not hurting each other, we're not hurting animals, and that it is so hard. I mean, it's just we try so hard in every imaginable way to get anyone to look, even just look at what happens to animals, and people constantly tell us, "I'm not going to look." So, I mean, what are we supposed to do? And if we can't have these conversations, even at the seat of power, even among the most privileged and powerful people, it is not safe for us to even ask them to answer these questions. Then what hope does our movement have? Not only what hope does our movement have, what hope does any movement have? If we cannot ask the most powerful people in the world who have the most influence on the future of the entire planet to address the existential crisis that's facing all the non-human animals, and frankly, at this point, even the human animals, then what's the point of politics? Let's just go back to monarchy and dictatorship. I'm sure I'm butchering some of the points he made, but it was something like that basically said, look, it was a very kind of humble piece that I thought set out the case for direct action and why people need to disrupt. And it convinced Leighton. Leighton actually wrote to me afterwards and he said, actually, never mind. I think this is good.
Yes. That's guy. I'm happy to hear that. I think.
Did I not pass it along to you at the time?
I'm sure you did.
I did pass it along. I said, hey,
like I said, I really blocked out some of the memories. It was a rough period. Yeah. A lot of unkind messages coming into my Facebook inbox for a while there. I mean, I think
were a lot of people accusing you of being racist?
Yeah. So, on reflection, 5 years later, I would say the lessons that I probably still haven't fully internalized from it, but that I think would be the lessons I ought to learn from it is, just that we're not playing on a level playing field, and we should, we might, we can cry that it's unfair, and then it just doesn't matter. So we have to make the most of the situation we're in. It was like a week before that, action. Li Feng at The Intercept had done some great reporting on Kamala's record.
Mm-hmm.
And, she's an extremely establishment, anti-human kind of politician.
Yeah.
She,
Kamala is a
had,
cop. That was the line back then.
yeah, that right. She was a cop. She, terrorized black families in San Francisco by threatening to prosecute people if their kids were truant from school, which anyone, has ever had a hard time with, a kid who's struggling. It's like the idea that's, holding the parents responsible by literally throwing them in jail was like a good solution to truancy. It was not only just insane, but obviously disproportionately fell on black and brown families. Yeah. And then
Did
she
you
gets
hear
to
a
the state
recent
level.
comment about how she's proud of the number of people she put in jail?
Right.
It's
So,
pretty bad.
I think
Scary.
I thought, I learned a little bit more about who this person was. This isn't someone that, activists, leftists, progressive people are going to, come to the defense of.
Yeah.
And, it's so like there's, and I can't say that, I don't think that everyone who, like all the, ordinary people who saw the media coverage were cynical in, applying the kind of identity lens to it. But certainly the journalists who were doing that, what would the reaction be if a white man had disrupted Condoleezza Rice in 2006 for her role in the, genocidal Iraq War?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it would have been very different. So it's obviously not about, just it's not as superficial as that.
And this is not the subject of this podcast, but I cannot help but add in this point because I've been looking into this more about Kamala as a cop. This is not some radical, defund the police, abolish the police criticism of Kamala Harris. Some of the stuff she did is beyond the pale, even from a conservative perspective. So, for example, I don't know if you know about this case where there was a man, he happened to be Latino. I don't think it actually matters if he's Latino, even if it's white. No one who's innocent deserves to be in prison. But in this case, actually, the reason it matters that he's Latino is he had done an interview with the police. He was accused of child molestation, right? And in the state of California, I forget which county it is. And he does an interview with the police because he doesn't get good advice from an attorney because he's Latino and doesn't know what to do. And so he talks to the cops. And he speaks in Spanish because he doesn't speak a word of English. And they take a transcript of his interview with the police. And the prosecutor fabricates a number of lines that indicate he has confessed to the crime. He just adds them to the transcript and sends them to the defense attorney and says, look, your client admitted he molested the child. He's got to go to prison. Take a plea. And the defense attorney at this point goes to his client and says, look, you admitted you molested the child. You're going to have to take a plea and you're going to have to go to prison, for some period of time. That's your only chance. Otherwise, you could get locked up for the rest of your life. This gets exposed, right? Which is blatant prosecutorial misconduct, totally unacceptable. And also, it's the most important evidence. If someone admitted to committing the crime, that's like the best evidence. And so the judge rightly says, look, this is your evidence in the case. You fabricated it. We have to dismiss the charges against this guy. Totally the right result, right? Guess who appeals that case and still tries to put this guy in prison?
Yeah.
Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris. These are the sorts of people she's often putting in prison. I've been in jail cells across the country. I'm not saying there aren't some people who've actually committed crimes. And I'm not saying that most of the people are completely innocent. But a much larger percentage of people are sitting in jail cells and cages today, as we speak, who are completely innocent of anything except being poor and black or a person of color and not having the ability to speak the same language that you and I speak, not having the resources to hire a lawyer. My cellmate when I was in Sonoma County, this guy was charged with burglary, a felony for stealing alcohol from Safeway. And he's guilty of basically being Vietnamese because when I looked at he showed me his discovery and he barely even speaks in English. And he can't communicate with his attorneys, but I was patient enough to sit with him and try and figure out what the hell he was saying, even though I don't speak any Vietnamese, but I had all day to sit with him and look at his discovery. And he was constantly complaining about this. And I was like, oh, sure, whatever. Everybody says they're innocent in jail. It's kind of like that line from the Shawshank Redemption where everyone says they're innocent except me, the one guilty man in jail. But this guy actually was innocent because I looked at the images that they took at the Safeway and they're just not him. It's like stupid white people who just think all Asian people look the same, put this guy in prison for basically being poor. He's addicted to drugs. He's definitely a very hostile person. Like at one point, the same guy threatened to stab me in the eye. So he's like he's got a lot of problems and he's not the nicest person. He's the sort of person that a lot of people would dislike. But again, that doesn't mean you deserve to be thrown in jail. And if you are that sort of person already and you get thrown in jail for a crime you didn't commit because you don't speak English and you have no teeth and you're addicted to meth and you're just like an easy conviction for the prosecutor who just wants to find someone who's responsible for stealing this alcohol from Safeway, they're going to throw you in jail. And Kamala Harris was the sort of prosecutor who threw probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of people like this in jail. And we have the big, and I'm preaching to the choir, especially with you, we have the biggest problem with mass incarceration in the entire developed world. We throw into cages more than 6 times the number of people as communist dictatorial China. We complain about the concentration camps in Xinjiang legitimately. I don't think anyone should be oppressed because of their race. Yet we have almost 2 million people sitting in cages today in the United States. And Kamala Harris was arguably the single biggest factor in that when she was attorney general and a prosecutor in San Francisco, because she was running the state's largest prosecutorial, the nation's largest prosecutorial department, other than the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., right? California has an ungodly number.
California is the capital of mass incarceration.
Absolutely. And this is the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party that says, that loves waving the flag, Black Lives Matter, civil rights. And they're throwing so many primarily Black men in jails. And it is an absolute outrage. And unfortunately, you're seeing that same corruption. Sorry, that was a much longer segue than I wanted to be. But I just had to get that in because it's so disturbing to me that so many people, in 2019 and 2020, who were putting Black Lives Matter signs outside of their homes and saying we need to, address police misconduct and address civil rights in this country, are now turning around and cheering her on when she says, I love putting people in jail. Like, I've got a gun in my house. I love being a cop. I think there's a lot of integrity and value in having an actual just law enforcement system that actually enforces the laws fairly, that focuses on restorative justice, that tries to rehabilitate people, that puts people in jail as a last resort, not as a first resort. That was not what Kamala Harris did when she was attorney general or when she was district attorney in San Francisco. She put lots and lots of completely innocent people in jail. And I love her in a lot of other ways because I think it's disappointing to me to say this because I actually think she's probably the most pro-animal presidential candidate in history. Granted, that's not a very high bar. It's like, don't be like Biden. Don't be like a monster who wants to see animals thrown in cages that are so small they can't turn around for the rest of their lives, which is what Biden wanted to do. He literally intervened in a case to prevent California from saving pigs from these poor, awful gestation crates. It's a very low bar, and I don't want to think this about Kamala, but 100% she's a product of the machine. And you're seeing right now in Denver, with the way the Democratic Party is responding to this ballot initiative, how the machine actually works. And it is so important that everybody understands this, because I'm not saying don't vote for Kamala. Vote for whoever your heart tells you to vote for. And certainly Trump has a lot of problems. He doesn't like people like me very much. So I'm obviously not Trump's biggest fan. He wants to kick immigrants out of this country. Having said that, if you think Kamala is a hope for the future of this country or for animals, you are deeply, deeply misguided. And we're seeing that with how the Democratic Party is responding to the slaughterhouse ban in Denver, too.
Yeah, I've been, I hope endearingly, but I've been teasing some of my close colleagues and activist friends who fall a bit further into the lib side of things than I do at this point. And but
I was kidding. I don't think Aidan is actually riding with Biden, but there are people who are actually riding with Biden.
Yeah. And it's I think I see like what's more clear to me than ever is that the difference between myself and folks that I know who are still excited about the Democratic Party or still feel that it's really, really important that we vote for Kamala and because the alternative is Trump.
Mm-hmm.
It's not at the underlying level of values. It's that, how many experiences have you had to disabuse you of the notion that like the systems and institutions that we, rely on in this country to have things like basically be fair are working. And, for me, absolutely similarly to you, the most enlightening experiences were being inside of the jail system, even for very small periods of time. I mean, you've been in much longer than I have. I've never spent more than 36 hours. And every time I'm in there, I am acutely aware I chose to be here and I have a support system that's, I don't feel really worried. The first time I was ever in jail, it was unexpected. I ran onto the field of the Colorado Rockies game, disrupting, they're protesting one of those pig farm investigations in California.
Are you supposed to be admitting all these things? Is Natalie going to get?
I'm never going to hear the end of it. But So that was, I was like 2016. I was 19 years old or something like that. But yeah, so that was the first time I went to jail. I wasn't expecting to, and I was in for 24 hours, and it was like, stressful and anxiety inducing, and didn't know when I was going to get out. They didn't have access to a phone to talk to people on the outside. But yeah, the people that I was in with, the level of like hopelessness that they were facing, and I remember some of the, absolutely, some of the people were in there for no other reason than driving while black. Mm-hmm. And then subsequent times I've been in there, it's like I'm in there with friends, and we're having fun, and I feel, yeah, ashamed of seeing, what everyone else who's in there who's not, basically isn't in there by choice, and isn't in there with their friends, and doesn't know when they're going to get out, and doesn't know how this is going to, completely derail their life. But absolutely, for some of my lib friends who I think might be going through that process right now, it's seeing, it's attending this meeting of the Denver Democratic Party, and seeing that, I think for people out on the streets of Denver who might think that, the Democratic Party like basically represents their values, like if they understood who the people are who are meeting on, this Saturday in September to kind of decide the endorsements, the positions that reflect the Democratic Party, if they understood like who those decision makers were, I think they'd be pretty horrified. Like it's corporate,
driven by
people
money,
with deep ties to business, lobbyists, like legacy politicians who basically see the public as like, and I hate, for lack of a better metaphor, you're gonna have to give me something here because it's so speciesist, but it's sheep to be herded. Like it's
herded and slaughtered and used when it's to their benefit.
Yeah,
100%.
And
so I've been in litigation with this Democratic Party hack. Do you know about this case?
I only recently heard. I haven't heard any of the details.
I just got a $30,000 settlement because so back in the mayoral campaign, he falsely accused me of sexual assault, and it's led to so many problems because so many people believe the most ridiculous nonsense. But there had never been any actual mainstream media outlet, or even borderline mainstream, not even like a blog, other than like an anonymous blog. Frankly, even the anonymous blogs that were used to attack me didn't say I had personally sexually assaulted anyone.
We always joked about this, and in the perennial dramas that came up with the XE. It's like, okay, you're being like human trafficking, and
it started with this guy. It really did
start label under the sun.
It did start with this.
Then you actually look at like the substance of the thing, and it's like even the person doing this can't bring themselves to say that something actually salacious happened. Like it's just like,
anyway, the human trafficking allegation is apparently that I once gave someone advice on a Zoom call that one way for them to get a visa is to get married, which is true. That's just true. Right. But anyways, so this guy who's a Democratic Party hack who is working for the incumbent mayor in 2020. And for the record, we were not running a negative campaign at all. I mean, our campaign was very much about we need to move more quickly on climate change. We need to tax the rich and get housing for everyone, but especially the homeless. And we need to fight for animal rights too. We want to make Berkeley the first plant-based city. And we got about 23% of the vote, which is probably 23% than a lot of people expected us to get. But still, we were second. It was like a 5-person race and we were second. We lost the incumbent mayor. But this dude who's a Democratic Party hack started whispering to all these people that I sexually assaulted someone, multiple people. And it just started bubbling up everywhere, including in the media, because he was spreading it, as far as I can tell, to multiple people. And lying about when I directly confronted him about this, he said, no, I didn't say that. People are making that up. And then we got an audio recording, and that's why I ultimately sued him. But the thing that's interesting is, as part of this litigation, we got discovery, which is essentially all his communications about the campaign. And as a surrogate of the mayor of Berkeley, a very progressive city, Democratic Party establishment, he was an establishment Democratic Party figure, Jesse Arreguin, who's now running for state Senate. And there's a good chance he's going to be our next House rep too. It's possible that he'll be a House rep at some point soon because he's very influential in the Bay Area. We get all these emails and communications, and I kid you not, there is not a single word substantively about what helps the community of Berkeley in these communications. It's all about money and power. It's all about how do we destroy the opposition, how do we win? And we asked for every communication he had about me in the Berkeley mayoral campaign. And there's no like sober policy analysis or, assessment of, why is Wayne's plan bad for the city of Berkeley? Or how do we advocate more effectively to show people why our policies are the right policies for the city of Berkeley? It's all about power. And it's one of the deep ironies is Nancy Pelosi, who's actually my current House member. She represents me in San Francisco. She just released a book called The Art of Power. And it's almost like at this point, they're not even afraid to admit it, that this has nothing to do. It's not the art of justice. It's not the art of equality or the art of policy even. It's just the art of power. Like, she's proud of the fact that I spent 40 years in Congress just accumulating power. And, I'm not.
Obama in his second book literally said, I pulled off this amazing feat. I was elected for president without standing for anything.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't see that. That's disturbing.
Yeah.
I mean, so if I felt like these folks actually had some value system, and because I do think there's a critique of the left that's quite legitimate, that we're afraid of power, and you and I have both seen this, that anytime you accumulate some power, then everyone on the left, especially in the grassroots, just comes after you. It's like, and unfortunately, you just can't get anything done with power. So it's not that power is completely irrelevant or we shouldn't think about power. We actually have to think about power, and we should be accumulating power. But it should be for a purpose, not for its own sake. In the Democratic Party, as far as I can tell in every interaction I've had with it, and I'm not saying there aren't exceptions on an individual level. I think there probably are individually good people. So you and I know someone who actually is an example. This Manny Rutinell in Colorado is somebody who's a Democratic Party member, I think, of the state assembly. Is that right?
State House.
Yeah. Okay. This is someone who's accumulating power, and I think for good purposes. He actually has a purpose. He wants to help people. He wants to help animals. He wants to help the environment. But the culture of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the mainstream political parties, they are 100% about accumulating power for its own sake. There is no purpose. And it's scary. It is completely fucking scary. And you're seeing that.
Yeah.
Just because the average Democratic Party operative, we know half of Americans want to ban slaughterhouses. The moment some influential company or influential outside lobby, which isn't even normally a Democratic lobby, like the Cattlemen's Association, the livestock industry, they donate mostly to the Republican Party, but they're powerful. And the moment that power comes to the Democratic Party and says, we're going to give you more money or power if you work with us, and you have these ragtag grassroots activists who have no power at all on the other side, they will always side with power over the powerless.
Yeah, I think so. Tying, I guess, back to the Denver issues, it's like I hope that for a lot of people involved in the campaign, it was a bit of a, I don't want to say wake up call necessarily, but a very revealing experience of recognizing, this party that, at the national level, I seem to have only these two choices. And, it seems like the Democratic Party is kind of representing my values. Like, just hopefully coming to this realization, like these people are not your friends. Yeah. This institution hates you and just doesn't respect you at all.
100%. And it's everything about the Democratic and the Republican Party. For the record, I mean, I'm not saying the Democratic Party is exclusive this way, but I think the best way to describe, especially national politics and these two mainstream political parties, is it's all just a performance. I mean, you look at Kamala Harris. I don't think it's a bad thing to change your mind about stuff. I change my mind all the time, and I think it's a great thing. But you should change your mind based on some reasoning or evidence, not just because it's politically convenient to do so. And on immigration, Kamala Harris was, literally chanting with people like no to deportations in 2019 and 2020 when it was popular because everyone was anti-Trump. And today she's talking about how she's going to be the border czar who's keeping all the immigrants out. Back in 2019, she was saying no to fracking. Climate change is an existential threat. We need to stop fossil fuels. Now she's all about how much I love fracking. Like, no explanation, no reasoning. She keeps saying this line where, my values haven't changed. It's my policies have changed. It's like, you didn't have any. Actually, that's true because you didn't have values in the first place.
Yeah, no values. Totally.
Your values didn't change because there were no values to start with. So your policies
there were none and there are none.
100%. The policies just change based on what is convenient for me to secure power. So if you're in a Democratic Party, right after the skies are red in San Francisco and when Standing Rock and Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise are strong, then you're going to be like, no fracking, yay, let's stop climate change. And the moment it changes for you and suddenly you want to win over Pennsylvania voters, you have no value system. So you're going to say fracking is the best. We need more fracking. And that's what the Biden administration has done in the last 4 years. Most voters don't know that the fossil fuel industry had record profits in production over the last 4 years in the United States. Record profits in production. So if you're a climate change voter, and again, you might say Trump is worse, but at some point, we have to say to ourselves, what sort of politicians do we want to lead us into the future? And the politicians do matter because they control, we talk a lot about the power each of us have to vote, to be activists, to eat vegan 3 times a day or more or less, depending on how many times you eat. But these politicians can make decisions that literally can affect the lives of hundreds of millions of animals with one stroke of the pen. When Trump expanded the commodity insurance program to cover the millions of animals who were roasted alive after COVID-19 shut down the slaughterhouses, that changed the lived experience of tens of millions of animals who were subsequently roasted alive and ventilation shut down. And it was all paid for by our money. Not Trump's money, not Biden's money, not Harris's money, by our money as taxpayers. We paid companies like Iowa Select Farms in Iowa, and our good friend Matt Johnson was one who exposed this. If not for the fact that he and a whistleblower within the company had not placed secret cameras and audio recording devices in that facility, no one would have even known this was happening, much less that we're paying for it. And these politicians, they don't have a value system because they don't even want to defend this. And like one of the most disturbing things I saw about the Democratic Party, I don't know about the deliberations that happen within the Democratic Party kind of central committee. Is it the central committee? Is that what they call it in Denver?
Oh yeah, Central Committee of the Denver Democrats.
But I'll sorry, I've been going on another rant, but I'll pass it on to you for your thoughts. And I want to hear about their conversation. But one of the most disturbing things I saw was the mayor coming out against this without even providing a word of reasoning. He just says, oh, by the way, don't vote for this. And sadly, a lot of people are still enamored of the Democratic Party. This is how they vote. Whatever the Democratic Party, because they think, I need to stand up to Trump. I need to stand up for democracy. So, vote for torturing animals. Okay, I guess that's what I do to stand up for democracy. So I'll just vote to torture more animals. And it's like, there isn't even a thought. And you don't blame people because like we live in a country where half of Americans who are renting are rent burden. They can barely even afford their homes. We live in a country where, metabolic disease, I think it's now like something like 1 in 2 teenagers are suffering from prediabetes or diabetes. It's some shocking figure. It's like teenagers are suffering So just in terms of our basic physical needs, there's a lot that people are dealing with. So they don't have time to figure out, wait, what does this slaughterhouse ban have to do with progressivism or defending democracy or Trump? Like, why do I listen to you when you tell me we should torture and slaughter more animals and pollute the water and the air in Denver? People don't have time. But the problem is, unless we make the time, and those of us who have the privilege, like you and I have enough privilege that we can be activists. But those of us that have the privilege have a responsibility. But then people who are seeing these actions, including like you taking the mic from Kamala, they also have the responsibility. Maybe you can't spend the hundreds of hours, or frankly, at this point for you, it's thousands or tens of thousands of hours trying to make the world a better place. But when someone who's trying to make the world a better place takes the mic from Kamala Harris's hands, I think all of our responsibility is to at least listen. Instead of listening to that 5-minute rant on MSNBC about how Aidan's racist because he took the mic out of Kamala Harris's hands, take a moment and read the article that Aidan wrote about why they did that. And maybe you change your mind because when you peel back that cover and you realize what the Democratic Party is supporting, you realize you don't support torturing animals. You realize you don't support fracking. You realize you don't support sending a Latino man to jail or trying to put him in jail when he was falsely accused of child molestation, and the prosecution running under Kamala Harris invented and fabricated the confession. You probably don't support those things, but those are things you support if you just check Democrat without peeling it back that cover. And the same thing has happened to the slaughterhouse ban. Most people would not support what they saw if they saw what was inside of that slaughterhouse. And if you accept what the Democratic Party says without thinking, you're going to support something that isn't just something that's against your values. That's so horrifying. You can't even stomach watching it, right? So it's extremely disappointing to me how the Democratic Party has responded both in Denver and in Sonoma County, because we've seen the same problems in Sonoma County, maybe even worse in Sonoma County.
Oh yeah, no, I mean the political machine in Sonoma. We've managed to kind of unite the whole political machine in Denver against us, but not to the point that it's expending nearly as significant a fraction of its resources as they are in Sonoma County. It's even to a much greater extent, the opposition there. I argue with my lib friends about I would never vote for a Democrat at
Really?
a national level. Probably not at not as the party. The party would have to be completely torn down and I don't think it will be. Yeah, I can't imagine a scenario where I would, a realistic scenario I'd vote for Democrat. But arguing about them with like the third party voting strategy, and it's not, I'm sure, what we're trying to get into here.
Yep.
But like, the gist being, if the Democrats can rely on you to plug your nose and vote every year, but they can't rely on people who want to go to the right, it's just going to move every 4 years. It's going to get further and further to the right.
Yeah.
So that's definitely my mindset. But when it comes to these issues, it's like I think it's just the cynicism, like the naked weaponization of these really shallow version of identity politics, where the fur ban, the allegations that we're committing genocide by trying to ban fur in Denver.
Wow.
And
so they've said that?
Oh yeah, the
Wow.
G word was dropped. I mean, in the context of an actual genocide happening. So even though if you still think that the Democratic
Party genocide because you didn't want to see animals skinned for fur. And this is because you're erasing the indigenous traditions or something like that? Is that the argument?
Yeah.
Because they were wild in California. They never went that far with us. They just accused us of being racist. They never said we were committing genocide.
Yeah. No, we got the G word. So, but even if you don't, you listen to whatever Wayne or I has to say about the Democrats, and you still, at the end of the day, think that this is a party that's, going to be a vehicle for racial justice or economic justice, and you care about those things. I mean, you can, I think that's, I'm not trying to be mean, I think that's delusional. I think the party is, corrupt and evil, and I hope that it blows up, and I don't think that it's a vehicle for any of those things. But if you do think it's a vehicle for all those things, you still have to just really come, frankly, to terms with the fact that it absolutely is deeply antagonistic towards animals. Like this is not an institution that has any germ in it of being, a pro-animal institution that's going to take up the cause of, bettering the world for animals for any reason other than being absolutely forced to. So, just sobering up. And I think it was a great lesson that we all took home from this election cycle in both Sonoma County and in Denver, two very different Democratic parties, right? We're Sonoma County, a pretty rural Democratic Party, but still a county where the Democratic Party is dominant. And then you're talking about Denver, a purely urban county where the Democratic Party is about, the Democratic vote share in both counties is actually pretty similar. But in a lot of other ways, the counties are very different. But so getting to see, okay, here's like a spread, a sampling, and in both cases, the party machine is going to unite almost unanimously and with fervor against even modest pro-animal policies. It needs to inform our strategy. We just need to, as we are going to pick up the pieces after this election and dust ourselves off and figure out what comes next. What's our relationship going to be with this very powerful institution?
Win or lose. Win or lose. I think you have to think hard about that question.
Yeah.
Can you say more about what the Democratic Party has done to oppose the slaughter ban in Denver? Were you there in the room? Was there like a public meeting of some sort?
Yeah, so there were meetings in the lead up to it, and we met with a lot of people, and then there was like a day of meeting where they voted on the endorsement, and there was about 250 people who are members of the party. And
are these all elected officials? How does someone become a member of the Central
No,
County?
yeah, so it's interesting. It's different in every location. It seems like. So in Sonoma County, which is only about Sonoma County is about half the population of Denver. It was the committee that made these endorsement decisions was about 20 people. So Denver, being only about twice the size, was about 250 people. So it's just a very different system.
Okay. And are they elected in some sort of primary within the?
They're not elected. It's volunteers who step up, like anyone who takes on so in this sense, it's democratic in that it's people who volunteer as precinct organizers for the Denver Democratic Party, and I assume have to have been in that position for a certain amount of time in order to qualify for membership on the Central Committee. That said, it's like, I guess think of it, something I said to folks is, think of all the things that are like deeply wrong in the world right now. Like, think of all the things you could be volunteering your time for. Getting involved with the climate advocacy organization, all the things that the Democratic Party is, so profoundly failing to live up to, its kind of stated values on. To look at all those problems and decide, the thing that I'm going to, put my nights and weekends into is like the party that's, basically owned by military contractors
Mm-hmm.
and oil and gas companies and Wall Street firms. Like, that's who I'm going to volunteer for.
Yeah, it's a
I
very
think,
self-selection of people out
yeah,
there. I agree with that. I'm not saying there aren't good people who do that, because there
absolutely.
are
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean,
extraordinarily
we
good
met.
people.
Yeah, it
Like
wasn't.
Manny is one of them. Manny's, in my
Yeah,
view, just like
absolutely.
an incredibly good person who's in politics for
Yeah,
the right reasons. But I agree with you. It's rare.
yeah. So, and then it was the structure of the meeting was that we each side got to have a speaker attend for 3 minutes, and then there was a floor debate, and we didn't really there was a very kind of gatekeeping quality to it, where we couldn't get information in the lead up about how the process was going to work, or who were the members that were going to be deciding. Whereas the campaign against us had city council
Yep.
members allied with it. They have hired this lobbying firm in Denver called CRL Associates, which basically runs the city's politics. Like, they donate to every city council campaign.
Mm-hmm.
They, the slaughterhouse opposition campaign has paid something like 80, 100, maybe more than that, $1,000 to them for consulting services over the course of the campaign, and they're just deeply embedded with this institution, such that they know what the process is, and we don't, and no one's tells us. And so there were failures on our part. There were ways that we could have been more prepared for the meeting and tried to win over some more people. In the end, the vote was 207 to 12, so it felt a little bit overdetermined. But I also think maybe it was only decided that day when we went up and spoke for 3 minutes. Then they went up and spoke for 3 minutes, and we didn't get a chance to respond, and they say all kinds of shit about us. And then it devolves to this floor debate where we didn't have any friends in the room, and they had lots of friends in the room, so that a bunch of people spent the next 25 minutes calling us racists and every name under the sun for moving this ballot initiative. And then the vote fell down as it did.
Wow. Do you think? It sounds like you think. Do you think there was some organizing before this that was all planned? I mean, it sounds like it must have been, because
they were deeply organizing with it.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think it's like been this, the story of the campaign has been, we're out in the streets talking to voters, and we've got a big volunteer. We've we just talked to. We had this press conference yesterday to release the investigation that we were talking about earlier, and one of the journalists who we talked to, who's skeptical, and he hasn't necessarily been totally positive about his coverage, hasn't been positive, but he said the one thing he said to us is, the one thing I've heard is, like, you guys are just everywhere, like on the ground. We're outside. We've been outside the farmers markets every day, the whole summer for 2 years in a row. We've been, knocking on doors. We've been going to the parks. Like, people see us in Denver. They know that this campaign is on the ground as a physical presence. And so that's where we're running our campaign, and they're running their campaign, behind closed doors. They're meeting with city council candidates, or, city council members. They're meeting with these Democratic Party, everyone who has disproportionate power and influence over, what the narrative is going to be. And I'm not trying to, make it's effective. They know we've learned a lot. We're going to hopefully, the way that we obviously we need to do whatever's going to work and win for animals. And in the long run, we need to learn how to play that game. And I think that's one of the best things that's come out of this campaign is we are learning a lot more about how to play that game. Maybe
we need to play that game, but maybe we need to do something else. And I'm about to release a blog post about this. There's another way to describe the difference between what you're doing and what the opposition is doing. What the opposition is doing is not democracy. There's just not. Like, these sorts of backroom machinations among the elite, that literally is why the American Revolution happened. It's literally why the Greeks, thousands of years ago, came up with the idea that, actually, it's not so great if the government just is ruled by a handful of people. It should be ruled by everyone. That's the entire point. That crack democracy is like rule. Crack means rule. Demos means by the people. It's ruled by the people. And if you don't even have to talk to people, if the people don't matter to you in your advocacy and your political efforts, you're not actually practicing democracy. And the Democratic Party, ironically, is not practicing democracy when it just engages in these backroom machinations. So I think you might be right that we have to learn to play these backroom games. And to a certain extent, I think there's some truth to that. But one thing that Dan Kibbe and I have talked about a little bit, you probably have heard that Dan who's one of the co-founders of Animal Rebellion and Animal Rising. He left because he's concerned about the rise of fascism. And that means a lot of things to a lot of people. But to me, fundamentally, where he's right, regardless of what you think about that particular term, whether fascism is rising or what's causing it, there's a dramatic concentration of power that's occurred over the last 30 years in the hands of a very small number of people that is bad for the future of everyone. And that even includes the people of concentrations of power, because there's extremely good evidence that while in the short term, if you're one of the elites in those back rooms who gets to call the shots and decide we're going to torture animals or undermine people of color and throw people in cages for the rest of their lives, you might think you've got it good, that you're rich, you're living in your mansion. But at the end of the day, I mean, Thomas Piketty's research, Darren Asimov's research, these economists who've studied just from an economics perspective, if you maintain that sort of inequality for long, what happens is a revolt. The entire nation falls apart. There's a great book by Durand Asimoglu with the title "Why Nations Fail," and the answer is largely when they don't practice democracy. when you are working in these back rooms, when you're not able to directly address issues, and you don't actually go out there and talk to the people the way you all are, guess what? Everything in the long term collapses, including the entire nation, the entire political structure. So we've been going a while, so we should close up before 2 hours. Let me just end by saying, one, I think, and I told you this when you started, I told you I'm not super optimistic about ballot initiatives as a general matter, except for two things. One is they start lots of media conversations, and you've definitely achieved that. And they're a great mobilizational opportunity. Like, a lot of activists can get involved, and a lot of ordinary people are forced to engage with an issue because it's literally on the ballot that we're all going to vote on. Everyone's going to see the slaughter ban and the fur ban. But so in my view, those victories happen regardless of what the outcome is on November 5th. So let me just ask you this as a final question. What do you see as the greatest victory so far? I mean, obviously, if we win, that will be a great victory. But what do you see as the greatest victories of the campaign so far? And maybe even if you're projecting the future, win or lose the November 5th, what do you see as the greatest accomplishments of what you all been doing for the last year or two in Denver?
I would have to say, you already named some very important things, but I'd have to say that for this campaign, at the point in the history of the movement that it happened, it was learning value. It was the effect that it's going to have on our ability to, build on this and refine to such an extreme extent. I mean, I think maybe I started to share before we started recording that if we could start this campaign over again right now, I think we would win. We've learned so much, and we've gotten to steal so many moves from the opposition that some of which are shystery and corrupt and backroomy, but some of which are just smart, politics. Just they had good people working on
the shyster moves, Aidan.
Yeah, well, we don't have to do the shyster.
You're too good of a person. You can't even pull it off if you tried.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not a good liar. And my Historia Calamitatum is quite public. So I don't, I'm not going to become that person, but, so I think we could spank them if we had it over to do over again. And I don't think, they're learning. I don't think they're improving. 2 years from now, I don't think they'd be able to run a better campaign. 2 years from now, I think we'd be able to run a way better campaign. That was a huge part of why we did it. We said that at the very beginning when we chose the policies we were going to campaign on. The reason we chose the slaughterhouse ban, to answer your very big first question of the whole conversation finally, was that we wanted to choose a policy.
For us to get to that question.
2 hours. We wanted to choose a policy that was
typical of our conversations.
I know, right? It's great. It's been a long time since we had this much time to really get into it.
Last time was at Aura's house when we just sat at Aura's dinner table. And
I thought you were about to go to prison for years. I was like, this is the last time I'm going to see Wayne.
Who knew? It was only 45 days.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was before Smithfield. So at that time, it was
that's true. That was 0 days after Smithfield. Yeah.
But yeah, so we wanted a policy that was barely had a chance. That was going to take everything we had, that was going to force us to bring our 110% game, force us to stay up late nights and, as many people to get involved, inspire as many activists to get involved, and force them to work as hard as they could, because that was going to be the thing that was going to make us learn the most. Like if you set out knowing you're going to lose, you can learn a lot from losing, but if you set out knowing you're going to lose, you're not going to learn anything because you're not going to try.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to pick something that, okay, it's not a completely foregone conclusion that it's going to lose. Like, it has a chance, and I do think we still have a chance, absolutely. Especially in light of yesterday's announcement, investigation. Yeah. I think that's going to be the game changer. If we win, it's going to come down to that.
Can I actually say one thing? Regarding the Denver Post op-ed, I was just looking up earlier when you were talking. The op-ed, part of the reason they say they don't support the ballot initiative, and this is a direct quote, is because there is no evidence that the Superior Farms facility in Globeville is guilty of failing to properly stun animals.
Yep.
We now have that evidence.
We now have that
very, very clearly, and it's in the national media.
You're
right.
Justin Marceau said exactly. That was exactly how Justin opened his comments.
That is exactly what Justin said. He's a professor of law who is an expert in animal law, among other issues, and he said that in the press conference. And so there is overwhelming evidence now that they failed to properly stun animals at this facility. So if that is the basis upon which the Denver Post is saying, don't vote for this proposition, well, now
they should retract.
Let's say they should retract and reverse themselves. You should go to the editorial department of the Denver Post and say, look, you said this is the reason why. Well, now we've given you the proof that this is actually happening. So let's hope you actually have integrity and reverse your position. Well, not optimistic.
Yeah, not optimistic. I think
you're right. It's a corporate media outlet.
They had their decision made up long before any conversation.
Sure. They're not looking at evidence or logic, much less ethics.
So, in that sense, it's been a huge success, and we have already won so much. We've already won, the birth of a really strong new activist community in Denver that has inspired a lot of people. And I get people emailing me several times a week saying, are you guys going to spread to other cities? I want to do this kind of campaign in my city. People are so excited about this approach. I think, it's going to take us
part of what you want to do, right? You want to create a template that you can run ballot initiatives on a grassroots level all over the country.
We barely talked about this, but this was a pilot campaign. Our goal after this is going to kind of try to build a campaign in a box that we can put in anyone's hands in any city in the country and say, okay, this is everything you're going to need to do. It's way, I think this is something like Anonymous to the Voiceless has done very effectively, is make it really easy for someone to start, a chapter. Here's everything you need to do. This is about 100 times more complicated. So it's, we're raising the threshold, but I think it's about, 150 or 200 or 1,000 times more impactful potentially. So that's where we're going.
And also, it makes it so much easier if you have a template.
Right.
That just is true of everything. If you have a template, it's true of legal work, it's true of persuasion, it's true of anything. So having a template is so important.
So I think that's the win. That's the biggest win, is that template is going to exist. And the next, this is happening. I think, something that happened, we look at an example of a movement where ballot measures played a really important role. We could talk more about gay marriage for something that's, as maybe socially fraught as this one, but a different example that was more kind of where the advocates were playing offense was the cannabis legalization movement. And, the first cannabis legalization ballot initiative happened in 1970 something in California. And it was, didn't pass obviously, but it was just put the issue on the table, and it took a couple more decades to simmer. Started up again in 1990s. By 1998, every single election year, so every even year election, there was at least one state in the country that was voting on cannabis legalization. So the issue, once you open that floodgate, the issue just wouldn't go away. And that's the point that we're at right now. This issue is not going to go away. And eventually we're going to start winning. And maybe it's going to be.
Can I ask you, I'm sorry to do this because that would be a great way to end the show. And maybe I should just end the show. But what is the most important thing you've learned from this campaign that you would pass along, say to your future self, or maybe your past self? If you could communicate with your past self when you started this, what would you say is the most important thing you've learned?
So my past. So when we were starting this campaign, we said, what's so exciting about ballot initiatives is it's a way to totally bypass the sort of existing power structures that control the lawmaking process and go directly to voters and engage in real democracy. And I'd say the lesson, and there's several very specific actionable takeaways of this that I could get into, or, folks can look out for blogs coming out from us in the months following the election where we're going to be really digesting all of this. But the pattern, at the pattern level, the lesson is it's not that simple. The institutions and powerful factions that control the, political process do get to exert a lot of influence over ballot initiative campaigns. The media outlets that people look to as being, trusted local authoritative news outlets, even though they're all owned by private equity firms, and nobody should trust them, further than the paper. It's not worth the paper it's written on. But the Democratic Party, as we've talked about so much on this call, so we do need to grapple with those legacy institutions and not ignore them. And either we need to, find ways to at least demobilize them and keep them out of the fight, or we need to embrace an adversarial relationship with them and beat them, but we can't just ignore them, which is, I think, how we went around the campaign for up until the last month and a half. We thought, we're just going to go straight to voters. This is a ballot initiative. We don't need to worry about the city council. We don't need to worry about the mayor, Democratic Party. We're just going to voters. And that was an oversimplification of how the dynamic's actually going to work.
Interesting. Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you very much for all the efforts you've made for so many years for animals and for other causes. Really appreciate this. And yeah, after this all goes down, it'd be great to have you on again to debrief, because I'm sure people would be interested in, what you think of the result when it happens on November 5th. So yeah, let's do it. Okay.
Great. I'd love to come back.
All right.
Thanks
Until next time, my friend.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Ryan.
We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.